Okay, good morning, good afternoon. I want to this week we'll be looking at the interwar period in HY 3007. So I have two lectures prepared, which I have now, which I will be about to be uploading onto the Moodle site. They will be there by the time you hear this. In this first lecture, the one that I'm delivering now, I'll talk about the interwar period. I'll talk a little bit about the political challenges that the new states of Central and Eastern Europe faced in this period. And then in the second session, which is just below this, or should just be below this on the Moodle page, we'll talk about Karel Čapek, and we'll talk about his science fiction novel, The War with the Newts. And again, this is sort of, as I mentioned in our opening session, this is my intention to not simply talk about events and politics and this kind of thing, but also to talk a little bit about the people who are at the center of this story, to look at individuals and talk about their life stories, and in this way try to illuminate the most important points of the period. And of course, as with all history, it's ultimately about us. It's about people, and it's about human beings, and it cannot be understood properly unless human beings are put at the center of this story. Okay, so two lectures. Now, this lecture that I'm about to deliver, we'll see how it goes, but I'm ready to admit that it's quite a detailed one, and also a lot of this detail will be very new to you. So perhaps this is one of the few advantages of giving these sessions online. The lecture will be recorded, it will be there for posterity, and if everything starts to get too sort of dense, you can pause, go and open your textbook, go and look up information that I'm talking about online, and hopefully things will become a little clearer in doing that. This being said, this week's reading is Joseph Rothschild, and I've assigned the introductory survey, which I've said is on Moodle, but it's actually not. It's an e-copy at the university library. There's a hard copy as well. If you can get into the library, God help you. But there's an e-copy, and you can read the introductory survey. It's about 20 pages, 20 or 30 pages, and it will outline some of the things that I'm talking about today, some of the general problems and some of the general issues that the states in the interwar period faced. The book is actually composed of a series of case studies of individual states, so you're very welcome to go on and read some of those. There's a case study of Bulgaria, a case study of what was then Czechoslovakia, of Romania, of the Baltic states, and those will be very useful, in fact, when it comes time to write your national case study, when it comes time to write your assignment on nationalism and communism. So you can start thinking about which country you're interested in, and Rothschild is a very good sort of introductory guide. Will outline in a very clear way, I think, some of the most serious issues at stake in the interwar period. Okay, let's look then at the slideshow, and let's begin with the first slide. And I guess what I will say first of all is the following thing. The general feeling about the interwar period in Eastern and Central Europe is that it was a failure. As many of you will know, the interwar period, the period between the First and the Second World War, was a period of economic turmoil, at least in Europe, not so much actually in the Soviet Union. So in the 1920s and particularly the 1930s, all of Europe was racked by economic difficulties, particularly in the 1930s. And Central and Eastern Europe was not different. It was not immune from all of those kind of problems with the markets and the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression and all of these sorts of things. And of course, as always in history, or was very often in history, when there are economic problems, there are so too political problems. And again, this was also the case in Eastern and Central Europe. Now, a lot of these were states, a bit like Ireland, formed newly at the end of the First World War, and they were all formed as parliamentary democracies, modelled on the Western states, France particularly, but also Great Britain. So constitutional parliaments. Usually, they had a monarch. But the monarch was supposedly, not a particularly powerful political figure. If they didn't have a monarch, they had a president who was elected, not appointed. And you know, the idea was to sort of aspirationally become a little bit like those more well-established democracies, France and Great Britain. At the end of the First World War, at the very least, the prestige internationally of France and Great Britain was quite high. Those countries had been at the forefront of the victorious bloc of the First World War, and so they were countries which many people looked up to. You know, it's strange to think that living in Ireland, but nevertheless many people did. And so the politics of those states were modelled on those countries. Now, in almost all cases, and this is the second very important point, in almost in all cases, those states, those democracies did not survive. Within a very short period of time in the interwar period, within a decade in some cases even sooner, all of those countries succumbed to some kind of dictatorship, to some kind of authoritarian system of government. Now, again, that doesn't make them outliers in the interwar period. If we look at the history of a country like Italy, if we look at the history of a country like Spain, Portugal, or of course Germany, all of those countries also transformed from parliamentary democracies into dictatorships of some variation. So Eastern and Central Europe was not different in that respect. They also became dictatorships. They also became authoritarian states. What this meant, and I'll come back to this at the end of the lecture, but in the longer term, what this meant was that going forwards, if you wanted to challenge the prevailing political mood of the time, if you were critical to it, as we'll see in the coming weeks, the communist parties certainly were, you could quite easily look back on this period and say, well, look, it's failed. You know, we tried democracy, we tried parliamentary systems, we tried the Franco-British model, it didn't work. So we need to try something different. We need to try something radical. We need to try a new system of politics, like, for example, militant communism. So the interwar period is an economic and a political failure, and if you only take one or two things from this model, from this lecture, those will be the two lessons that are the most important ones. Okay, let's have a look at the slideshow. Slide number 1. I've put these very simple, very straightforward maps up just to give you a sense of how transformative the period. We're starting at the end of the First World War, but if you look at these two maps, one taken in 1914 and one taken in 1918, you can see that the map of Europe has transformed very drastically. The borders are different. The great empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, the Romanov Empire, those have disappeared from the map. The construction of Europe, the borders of Europe, the map of Europe has changed very greatly in just a short period of time. And of course, it has to do with the revolutions and the outcomes of the First World War. Now, I would argue, if we look at this map, and I think my arguments are backed up by this map, the most important changes, the most critical changes take place in Central and Eastern Europe. You can just see by looking at this map that the borders, the biggest, the most important, the most drastic border changes are taking place in the region that we're interested in Central and Eastern Europe. And the big change, the big transformation is the transformation out of empire and into one of nation states. So in most cases, the countries that we're interested in, countries like Czechoslovakia, countries like Hungary, countries like Yugoslavia, countries like Poland had been part of the great European empires before the First World War, and they had now become nation states. So the transformation, it's very often said that the 20th century is the beginning, the end of the First World War is the beginning of the era of nation states. And if this is true, The great transformation, the great arrival of new nation states is taking place generally in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, of course, there are other parts of the world, as we know. Ireland also breaks away from empire, partially breaks away from empire at the end of the First World War. In the Middle East, in places like Lebanon and Syria and Palestine, there are not exactly new nation states. They're so-called mandate countries, which are under the tutelage of the Western powers. But nevertheless, also the Ottoman Empire has disappeared from the map, which has consequences in places like North Africa, the Middle East, and in the Balkans. So it's a global moment, but indeed, within Europe, the big changes, the big transformations are taking place in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, the man responsible for this is the American president, a somewhat controversial figure these days, the American president Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a Princeton scholar who had, towards the end of the First World War, as the American president, the US president, had looked at what was happening in the war, and had decided, whether or not he was being naive, whether or not he fully understood the situation in Europe. He had decided that the problems that had caused the First World War, the reasons that the First World War had began, had a lot to do with the unequal way that empires were organized. The unequal way they treated their peoples, the unequal way, the duplicitous way they dealt with diplomacy. For Wilson, very simply, empire was the problem within Europe. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, to a certain extent the Romanov-Russian Empire, which of course in 1917 collapsed in two revolutions. These were the problems. These were the culprits. It was those empires that had started the First World War, and the lesson that Wilson took from the First World War is that empires should be replaced by a better political principle, a new political principle. And for Wilson, this was the principle of national self-determination. The notion that states should be organized not on an imperial principle, a dynastic principle, but on the period of nations. The nations like the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Poles, the Serbs, if you like. Those were the sort of the real sovereign forces within the world, within Europe, and in the future they should be given their own destinies, their own self-determination, and this would be a way of preventing a future conflict, and of ensuring that future wars could be avoided. Now, Wilson became briefly a great hero in these new states, places like Czechoslovakia, places like Yugoslavia. He was the champion of the small peoples. He was the champion for many people of these new states. So, for example, in a city like Prague, up until the end of the Second World War, the central train station was named for Woodrow Wilson. And to this day, in front of the train station, there is a statue of Woodrow Wilson, and there was a plaque to him, honouring him in the station itself. And throughout other capitals and other cities, places like Warsaw, the Romanian capital, Bucharest, all of these sorts of places, Woodrow Wilson was considered a great hero. The communists, of course, viewed him as an American imperialist, as a bourgeois politician, and we'll see that after the Second World War, his name was erased from most of the public spaces within Central and Eastern Europe, but not all of them, but most of them. So many of the squares and many of the streets and many of the statues that had been put up to Woodrow Wilson were taken down at the end of the Second World War. But in the interwar period, at least, for many people in Central and Eastern Europe, Woodrow Wilson was the great savior, the great champion. This great American president who had come to Europe at the end of the First World War and had championed the causes of these new states against the prevailing sort of imperial period. Now, as a side note, not directly related, to Eastern and Central Europe, but nevertheless something that I think is quite interesting and maybe will be interesting to many of you. Woodrow Wilson was also an appalling racist. Unequivocally somebody who believed in segregation in the United States. As president of Princeton University, fought against the enrollment of African American students. Was basically a sort of classic Southern segregationist, and there has been a discussion, not a hugely vocal one, but we've seen in the past year, haven't we, in these past few months, the people like Edward Colson in Bristol, his statue came down. There's been a discussion about Winston Churchill and whether it's right for him to be deified, given his track record also of imperialism and racism. And Woodrow Wilson has fallen under this discussion as well. He's also come under scrutiny for his racist comments. So it's not directly relevant, but nevertheless, on a global perspective, it's quite interesting that somebody like Woodrow Wilson would be considered a great hero of these lesser national groups, the Slavs, the Poles, the Czechs, and so on. But nevertheless, on a global scale, somebody who upheld the British Empire and its colonies, the French Empire and their colonies, the doctrine of involvement in Central America for the US. So he's a contradictory figure, but nevertheless one who was considered to be a hero for many people in Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, now there was a problem with the principle that Wilson laid down for these new states, for Central and Eastern Europe. The idea of national self-determination, we could argue, was a very good one. Anti-imperialist, much more democratic than the way the old empires were organized. So the notion that going forward, these empires would be taken off the map, and new, fairer, more democratic nation states would emerge was a pretty good one, if you like, at least on paper. Notionally, this was a good idea. However, in practice, it was enormously difficult to apply in a consistent fashion the principle of national self-determination. Now, the reason for this is a relatively straightforward one. If we skip forward to slide number 4, I put up a map of what was in Europe before the end of the First World War, the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire. These two great empires, most people in Central and Eastern Europe, and also the Balkans, which is another area that we're interested in for this module, had a long experience of living under these two empires. And the legacies of empires, the imperial legacies, the imperial residues, came from these experiences of living under these two empires. Now, the empires, to a certain extent, were not interested in nations per se. They were interested in other things. They were interested in institutions like the armies, the churches. They were interested in the royal families, the throne, the Ottoman Sultan, or the Habsburg Emperor. They were interested in other sort of principles. They were relatively blind to the national principle. Now, given that those empires had been around for many hundreds of years, what that meant was that the territories in question were very ethnically diverse. It was extremely difficult to find a consolidated patch of territory wherein there was only a single national group. Now, there are various reasons for this, which I can outline very briefly. One reason would of course be the imperial tradition, the imperial practice of settler colonialism. It's not that different from what happened, for example, in Ireland. As many of you will know, the story of the Ulster Plantation, various British monarchs, successive British monarchs wanting a loyal base within this imperial territory, encouraged Protestant settlers to go to Ulster, and as a result of this, right up until the 21st century, there is a confessional divide, an ethnic mix within at least the northern territories, the northern parts of Ireland. Well, the Habsburg Empire did a very similar thing. In various parts of the empire, they would settle German or Saxon people, give them land, give them certain military alleviations or military service. And so in places, like what would become Poland, what would become Czechoslovakia, there are very large non-Slav populations, very large German populations. And of course, these people, almost uniformly at the end of the First World War, were not happy about being part of a Slavic state. Now, again, the Irish parallel, I think, is quite a telling one. At the end of the First World War, as Ireland decolonized, as we all know, there was the problem of what to do with Ulster. There was this discussion about what would happen to those people, Protestants, who did not want to be part under any circumstances of this new Irish Free State. And we all know the sad story about the treaty and the anti-treaty and the subsequent civil war, and the border conflict in the 1950s and the troubles in the 1970s, the 80s and 90s. So the British approach to this was to try to compromise, if you like, was to try to sort of leave parts of Irish territory under British suzerainty, under British control. Now, there are similar debates within Central and Eastern Europe. One example would be Czechoslovakia. The borders of the new state, we'll look at them momentarily, but the borders of the new state, as proposed at the Paris peace treaties, which ended the First World War, encompassed very large numbers of Germans. Now, these Germans, up until the end of the First World War, had been part of the Habsburg Empire. In the Habsburg Empire, ethnic Germans, Austrians, were, of course, the dominant group, the dominant force in politics, the dominant force in the bureaucracy, the dominant force in the army. The high command was mainly Germanic. Now they were faced with the prospect at the end of the First World War of losing this loss of status, of no longer being the first amongst equals as an ethnic group, but now being a minority in a Slavic-dominated state, in a state that was dominated by Czechs and Slovaks. So it's a very difficult thing for many Austrian Germans to face up to. They had considered the Czechs to be kind of like a peasant people, didn't speak the Czech language, didn't know the Czech language, looked down upon the Czechs as an inferior people. So it was very difficult for them, the prospect of living within a Slavic state. And of course, there are similar stories in Poland, with a very large German population in their Prussian territories, and in Silesia, and a very similar situation also in Yugoslavia, which had quite a large population of ethnic Germans as well. Now, the peacemakers, the British and the French primarily, would not truck any compromises. They did not want to start diminishing and eroding the integral power, the centralized power of these new states. They wanted Czechoslovakia to be ruled from Prague, not from Vienna, not from Berlin, not from some regional German center. So in all cases, these suits were turned down. The Germans who wanted to sort of get out of Czechoslovakia were not allowed to do so. In all cases, the principle of national self-determination, although it was appealed for by many people, was turned down if it did not suit the new borders. Now, another story would be the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire did not have a strong tradition of settler colonialism, but nevertheless was, of course, an Islamic empire. And then the Ottoman Empire had been in the Balkans and had been in Europe since the 14th century. It had been continuously a presence within the Balkans, within places like what is today Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Bulgaria, Montenegro, Macedonia, Greece, these sorts of territories. Now, the Ottoman Empire, of being an Islamic empire, meant, and we'll come back to this at a later stage, this is quite an interesting but quite a complex topic. It meant that many Christians who were living within the borders of the Ottoman Empire converted to Islam for various reasons. Better rights, better privileges, better economic opportunities. So that meant that there was another confessional complication, if you like, another confessional divide within Europe. In parts of the Balkans, in places like Albania, in places like Bulgaria, in places like what was now, at the end of the First World War, Yugoslavia, there was also a very large Islamic presence, a very large Muslim presence. And these were people in almost all cases, who were the descendants of people who had been Christians but had converted mainly in the early modern period. Now, we'll come back to these complex questions at length later on in the module, but I mention them now only so that you'll understand some of the reasons why these territories were so complex in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their religions, in terms of their nationalities. Centuries of imperial rule, centuries of settler colonialism, centuries of proselytization, centuries of religious conversion had created a very complex tapestry within Central and Eastern Europe. And the principle of national self-determination, no matter how laudable this principle might be, was in practice a very difficult one to apply. The new nation states were not nationally homogeneous. They had very complex interior ethnic makeups. Okay, how complex? We can have a look, and here's where it gets a little bit detailed. So let's take this slowly, and if you need to pause this video, by all means do so, and go get a coffee or go get something stronger, and try to sort of absorb some of the lessons that I'm putting through. I have a succession of maps which will just show you some of the ethnic complexities. Let's start with map number 5. These are the borders of the new Polish state. Now, we'll come back to Poland repeatedly in the weeks to come, but for the time being, Poland had not been a state since the end of it had been divided by the so-called partitioning powers, by the great empires at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And Polish nationalists in the 19th century, again, a little bit like Irish nationalists, had been at loggerheads about how best to restore their statehood, to restore the Polish state. And it had been a very complicated and a very, very sort of involved discussion. We will come back to this at a later stage. But anyway, what this meant in practice was that the Poland that was formed at the end of the First World War, in fact, was composed of various territories. There had been parts of it, like Galicia, which had been part of the Habsburg monarchy. Places like Prussia and Silesia had been part of the Prussian Empire, the German Empire, and other parts in the east of the country, like Warsaw, and such cities, had been part of the Russian Empire, the Romanov Empire. So they had undergone very different historical experiences, which means different legal codes, means different languages of bureaucracy, different currencies, all of these sorts of things. And the state builders of the new Polish state in 1918 were faced with this formidable task of trying to unify all of these different traditions, of trying to bring a state that had not existed for over a century into being, to try to find a single legal code, a single taxation system, a single educational system, of course a single army. That was a question of huge importance. They needed to create Polish national institutions, and they needed to do this in very short order. Now you can see also that the ethnic territories, the ethnic makeup of Poland was very complicated, much more complicated than it is in the 21st century. In the Poland of the interwar period, there were Ukrainians, there were Germans, there were Ruthenians, there were of course Poles, but Poles only made up about 70% of the population. So it was an enormously complex challenge. Now, the next state, let's have a look very quickly at Czechoslovakia. Again, you can kind of see some of the problems, some of the ethnic divides that this state was facing. There were Czechs and there were Slovaks, and the Czechs and the Slovaks were the state-forming people. They were the people who sort of, the state belonged to them, if you like. But there are very large national minorities as well. In Slovakia, there is a very large number of Hungarians down in the south of Slovakia. In the east, there are large numbers of what we would call today Ukrainians in the very east of the Slovakian territories, no longer part of Slovakia in the 21st century. And as you can see from this map, these dark blue patches in Czechoslovakia were home to a very large German minority, and there were several million Germans living in Czechoslovakia. The Germans, in fact, outnumbered the Slovaks, despite the Slovaks being one of the state-forming people. So again, a very complicated ethnic mix, and the new leaders, the new rulers of Czechoslovakia were faced with the challenges of bringing all of this together. We'll talk more about Czechoslovakia in our afternoon session, in the next video, so I won't dwell on that state for the time being. Map number 7 shows an image of Yugoslavia. And again, we'll talk a lot about Yugoslavia in the coming months, but for my money, Yugoslavia was the most complex of all of the new states. The term Yugoslavia in Slavic languages, Jug, means south, and Slav, of course, means Slavic. So it was the country of South Slavs. But in fact, within this territory, there was enormous complexity, enormous diversity. There were Catholics, Christian Catholics. There were Orthodox Christians. There were Muslims in places like Bosnia and Kosovo. There were Albanians. There were Hungarians. There were Germans in the northern territories. All of this was a result of this state coming together on the ruins not only of the Habsburg Empire but also of the Ottoman Empire. So its history, its prehistory, was extremely complicated. And again, coming back to the point that I made about the other states, those countries needed to bring together a range of different historical traditions. Okay, I don't want to overload you all with a huge amount of information. So the last state that I'll talk about is the interwar kingdom of Romania. Again, a country whose borders expanded greatly. There had been a Romanian state before the First World War, but the borders of the state expanded greatly at the end of the First World War. And what this meant was that now Romanians shared a state, and mainly expanded into Transylvania, what is still today part of the Western territories of Romania. Now, what this meant was that the new state also had very large numbers of ethnic minorities, not Hungarians mainly, but also a Jewish population. So for many Romanians, this was kind of an anxiety-inducing thing. They had always lived on their own as Romanians in this state, but in the interwar period, this greatly expanded state included many national minorities, and this resulted, as it so often does, in a kind of in sort of xenophobic impulses, chauvinistic impulses on the part of nationalist groups against those minorities. So things like anti-Semitism, anti-Hungarianism became quite widespread in the interwar kingdom. And there was even a relatively successful, we'll come back to them later on, but there was even a relatively successful Hungarian fascist movement in the interwar kingdom of Romania, the so-called Iron Guard, led by this charismatic leader, Ion Codreanu. Name of the guy was Codreanu. So, to recap on those various states, that survey, which I admit was quite a lot of new information, essentially the story is the following one. These were states which more or less came into being at the end of the First World War, had been to a greater or lesser extent in their history before that part of the Habsburg Empire or the Ottoman Empire, included within their countries great diversity, great difference, which the new state builders needed to manage, needed to deal with. And on top of all of this, the simple Wilsonian principle of national self-determination did not do full credit to the complexity of these states. To simply say Romania for the Romanians was to sort of elide, was to sort of ignore the very many Saxons, Germans that were living in the country, Jewish population, Hungarian population, ditto with Poland. Poland for the Poles excluded a whopping 30% of the population who were not Polish. So the principle of national self-determination, a laudable one for many people, an admirable one, one which was applied with very good intentions by Wilson and by the state bill and by the peacemakers of Paris, was nevertheless one which was extremely difficult to impose in practice. So the new states were faced with enormous difficulties in sort of consolidating their rule and consolidating their new power. Now, it can be done, I suppose, and very, very often we'll talk about the first Czechoslovak president, a man called Tomáš Masaryk, in the second session. But he was on record in the 1930s as saying, we can do this. We can build a Czechoslovak state. We just need peace and quiet. We just need a Europe that is not at war. We need, say, another 20 years. He said this in the mid-1930s. And we'll be able to resolve these problems. We'll be able to bring on board the Germans. We'll be able to bring on board the Slovaks, many of whom are not happy with the state. We'll be able to consolidate our economy. We'll be able to sort of embed ourselves on the map of Europe. We just need more time. This is very difficult and very important work. We need time and we need peace and quiet. Now, neither of those things were at a premium in the interwar period. As many of you will know, the history of Europe and the history of the world in the 1920s and the 1930s is not a peaceful one. There are various challenges, economic and political, which are simply getting worse and worse as the interwar period rolls on. And all of this complex work of state building needed to be completed in a very tumultuous environment. Masaryk's desired peace and quiet was not forthcoming. So what were these challenges? Well, let's have a look at slide number 9. There is the great man himself, Joseph Stalin. There had been changes as well, revolutionary changes, of course, in the Russian Empire in 1917 and then on in the 1920s. This very backward autocratic state had transformed into a militant left-wing revolutionary state led by the communist Bolsheviks. And for many people, including national governments in Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviets posed a considerable threat. The notion of a global international communist revolution was one that was greatly feared by many people in countries like Poland, in countries like Czechoslovakia, in countries like Yugoslavia. Those were national governments, in many cases quite conservative in their outlook, monarchies, as I said earlier, not well disposed towards the communist movement. So the presence of this very large, potentially aggressive neighbour in the East was one which was looked upon balefully by many people in Central and Eastern Europe. And there was good reason. If we take a country like Poland, the Polish government, the Polish state, in fact fought a short war with the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, in 1919 and 1920 over their eastern territories, places that are today in Ukraine and Belarus. Now the Poles won that war, but nevertheless there were very large parts of the new Polish state, most of the eastern parts of the new state, which had formerly been part of the Russian Empire. And in many ways the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union, thought imperialistically about their near abroad, about the territories that were on their borders. And so for the Poles, there was a looming threat of a possible sort of resurgence of the Soviet Union. Now, in slide number 11, if we turn to the West now, there was also Germany. Germany, of course, in 1918 was one of the defeated countries of the First World War. but its defeat was only apparent. It was not an actual defeat. Very quickly, the German state, politically, economically, industrially, was able to recover and once again become a major factor, a major force in European politics, in international relations. And of course, particularly when Adolf Hitler came to power in the early 1930s, 1933, 1934 is when Hitler and the Nazi Party consolidated their power in Germany. This also posed a potentially very large threat to Central and Eastern Europe. And one of the reasons was that Hitler, of course, was extremely opposed to the peace conferences and the decisions that had been taken by people like Wilson and by the French and the British at the end of the First World War. He looked upon territories such as the eastern parts of Czechoslovakia, where there was a very large German population, and claimed actually that these should rightfully be part of Germany, that they were sort of imprisoned within a Slavic state, that they needed to be reconnected and reunified with the German state. And Hitler was very vocal about this. And there were very many Germans living in Czechoslovakia who were extremely receptive to his cries, to his pleas that those territories should be restored to an expanded Germany. And it was not different in Poland. German-populated Polish lands in Prussia and in Silesia were also coveted by Adolf Hitler. So that was also a big threat to the Central and Eastern European states, and one which they had to sort of deal with. So in a sense, they were kind of sandwiched between two potentially belligerent, between two potentially hostile states: the Soviet Union in the east and and Nazi Germany in the west. Now, on top of this, if we turn to slide number 12. There was, of course, the economic crisis, which did not contribute in a good way to the political direction of countries throughout Europe, but also the countries that we're interested in. Now, the Wall Street crash arrives in 1929, and the economic downturn is a global problem. There are very few parts of the world that are not connected to the global capitalist economy. At this stage, the Soviet Union would be a notable exception. It did not suffer too badly in the 1930s. In fact, its economy was quite strong, mainly because it was based on slave labor and the Gulag and these terrible sort of 5-year plans. But nevertheless, it was functioning quite well. The Wall Street crash hit also countries of Eastern and Central Europe, and the 1930s particularly is a period of economic downturn and economic turmoil. But in fact, almost all of those states had been in a state of depression since the 1920s. Almost every single state in Central and Eastern Europe was largely an agrarian economy, a peasant economy. Romania, Yugoslavia, Poland, the Baltic states, Bulgaria, almost all, so 80, 90, in some cases 95% of their economy were based on agrarian, agricultural matters. And in fact, since the end of the First World War, they had been in a state of agricultural depression. They had been ruptured from their traditional markets, ruptured from the Habsburg Empire, ruptured from the Russian markets. They had to try to find new, smaller markets, and they were not successful in doing so. So in fact, throughout the interwar period, in almost all cases, it's true that not one of these states, almost all of these states, is in a state of permanent depression of one kind and the other. If it's not the agricultural depression, then it's the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s. So it's a very difficult period economically. There's one state that bucks this trend, that's Czechoslovakia, and we'll talk about that in the next session. Now, what this means, if we turn to slide number 13, appropriately enough, unlucky for some, every single one of these states, with one exception, drifted away from parliamentary democracy and into dictatorship. And this happened very quickly. In slide number 13, I put up a rogues gallery of the kind of people who would become the rulers, the dictators of Eastern and Central Europe in the interwar period. Now, there's a very good book, a collection of essays by Rebecca Haynes and Martin Rady, In the Shadow of Hitler, Personalities of the Right in Central and Eastern Europe. It's kind of a series of portraits of some of the men, all of them are men, that I've put up in these on this slide, and you can go and have a look at some of these. I think we have this as an ebook, so you can go and have a look at some of these figures in your own time and get to know them, if you wish, a little bit better. As I say, they're all men. As you can see by the way they're dressed, this is not simply cosplay. All of them, in most cases, have some sort of military connection. They're all coming out of parts of the army, and of course their dictatorships, in all cases, are enjoying significant support from the army. They could not impose these. They could not impose their dictatorships were it not for the support of the armies. Okay, so let's look at slide number 14 and recap. The story of the interwar period is generally considered by most people and in almost all states to be a story of failure. Small states emerging out of empire, lots of problems within them, economically and politically weak, and struggling throughout the interwar period. Now, the interwar period is a very dark and tumultuous one throughout the world and in Europe as well. A rise of this radical right-wing dictatorship in the West, Nazi Germany. There was also, of course, fascist Italy, another revisionist power, another power which wants to revise the borders, which wants to take territories away from Albania, away from Yugoslavia, another threat, which in fact I didn't mention much in today's lecture. In the East, you have the Bolshevik state, the Soviet Union, also potentially a threat for countries like Romania, for countries like Poland, for countries like the Baltics, all of which include territories which had been part of the Romanov Empire. So in Romania, that would be Bessarabia. In Poland, it would be the Eastern Marches, the Eastern Territories, and in the Baltics, it would be all of the Baltics, of course, had been part of the Russian Empire. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had been in their entirety part of Russia. And the Bolsheviks were very imperialistic in the way they thought about their borders. They also coveted a return of those territories, and in fact they got it at the end of the Second World War. They absorbed those territories back into the Soviet Union. So a difficult period. Now, they had hoped at the end of the First World War for support from France and Great Britain. France and Great Britain, of course, were the winners of the First World War. They were the great states which dictated the terms of the peace. And it seemed initially, at least, that they would be great supporters of these new states in Central and Eastern Europe, that they would support their territories, their integrity, that they would give them financial assistance, perhaps military assistance, if that would become necessary. But unfortunately, very quickly, it became clear that France and Great Britain were not committed in a meaningful way to supporting the integrity and the consolidation of those new states. It was lip service, which very quickly evaporated, and we'll see in our second session that the great sort of the great perceived betrayal took place in 1938 when the British colluded with Nazi Germany to annex parts of the Czechoslovak state. All of this without the involvement of the Czechoslovak government, and this was really the end of New Europe, of these new Central and Eastern European states. And Poland, of course, was invaded by the Nazis shortly thereafter. So it's a story of failure. And if you look back on the interwar period from any vantage point in the 20th century, you would be able to say, well, look, this hasn't worked. We tried democracy, we tried nations, we tried these new states, we tried to put our faith in the British and the French, and we were let down very badly. They did not support us in a meaningful way. We lost our independence quite quickly. The interwar period is a period of failure. Okay, now finally, the last slide, and then I'll wrap up. Let's talk about the communists. They are, after all, I wouldn't say the stars, but the main protagonists of this module. This is a module about communism, and so we should talk a little bit about them. The communist parties, there were communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe. Most of them formed at the end of the First World War. Most of them affiliated with the Soviet Union and with the Bolsheviks. In many cases, these were quite large parties, particularly in the Balkans. There was a very large, for example, Yugoslav Communist Party, at least initially. There was a very large Bulgarian Communist Party. There was a sizable Czechoslovak Communist Party, and then much smaller in places like Poland, Romania, and Hungary. The Communist Party in those states was not such a large concern. Now, they were legalized in the interwar period in every single one of these states except for Czechoslovakia. Legislation was introduced mostly in the early 1920s, which criminalized the interwar parties, which criminalized the communist parties. Now, that there are various things that the communist parties had done to provoke, if you like, this very draconian legislation. In many cases, as part of the revolutionary agenda, communist cadres carried out terrorist attacks, assassinations of politicians, of generals. In some cases, they bombed trains. The most notorious terrorist attack took place in Bulgaria in 1925. The Communist Party detonated explosives at a church which was holding a ceremony, a funeral for a general of the Bulgarian army, and at this funeral, all of the greats, so the prime minister, the king, the government, all of the high command of the army were present. And it was the Bulgarian Communist Party's hope that they would be able to kill them all in this bomb strike. They didn't. In fact, they didn't kill a single high-ranking political or military figure, but the bomb did kill 140 people. I put up a PAFE, a newsreel, silent newsreel, which shows you the extent of the destruction. It was the largest terrorist attack in Europe in the 20th century, and up until the Madrid bombs, the train bombs, I think of 2005, was it? 2004? It was the largest terrorist attack on European soil to date. So for these reasons, the communists were illegalized. They were forced underground. But in many cases, what that meant was that in the interwar period, the Communist Party transformed from a sort of open political force which would contest elections, which would operate actively, and became kind of like an underground movement based on sort of small cells, operating under front operations, mainly through the trades union organization, based on cadres of people who were like Leninist professional revolutionaries, fully dedicated to the cause. Many of them had been in prison, so they had an experience of being interrogated, and in many cases tortured by the governments and the military of the time, the gendarmerie of the time. And as a result of this, they were very good at underground work and very good at revolutionary work. And what that meant, we'll see when we talk next week about the Second World War, is that they were very well placed to lead resistance in occupied territories and ultimately to seize power at the end of the Second World War. Okay, we'll leave it there, and I'll stop. I'll get some water, and then I'll start recording the Chapek video, which you will find beneath this link on the Moodle site. Thank you.